Imagine you're listening to a story on a dusty roadside, the sun angling toward late afternoon, your hands still gritty from work. A teacher you have only heard rumors about opens his mouth and starts with something you know by heart: seed and soil, a lamp on a stand, a woman kneading dough, a fisherman and his nets, a father with 2 sons, a vineyard and its wages. But then the story takes a turn you did not expect. The respectable person looks small. The expendable person becomes the center. The normal path curves. Your stomach drops a little, and you realize this is not a proverb you can pocket and forget. It is a word that wants to rearrange your sense of what is possible, and to leave a question buzzing in the air long after the story ends. That feeling, the jolt, the unfinishedness, the argument that follows you, is the native climate of the parables. If we want to hear them as they were meant to work, we have to let that climate change our breathing. Parables are not inspirational quotes from antiquity. They are surgical stories that cut where the skin looks unbroken, and to our surprise, also heal what we did not know was wounded. They are short because they were designed for memory in an oral culture. They are simple because they borrow the furniture of ordinary life: fields and ovens, coins and creditors, feasts and neighbors. And they are confusing because the simplicity is camouflage. They do their work by slipping past defenses, provoking recognition, and re-aiming desire. The first step, then, is to stop treating parables like fortune cookies. Tidy morals will always be available. Be nice, work hard. Do not waste your talents. Rejoice when the lost are found. There is truth in each of those lines, but if we stop there, we have turned the stories into museum placards. The parables do not merely inform, they perform. They do not just tell, they act. Their goal is not that we agree with a statement, but that we become a kind of people. They aim to rewire reflexes, not only to polish ideas. The quickest way to miss them is to turn them into advice you already intended to follow. So what exactly is a parable in Jesus' world? In the Jewish tradition, it is a mashal, a comparison, a riddle, a saying that sharpens as it turns. Teachers used mashalim to persuade, to puzzle, and to indict. The energy comes from everyday life, which in first century Galilee meant subsistence farming under imperial taxation, fishing under lease arrangements, land held in fragile family trusts, and village life knotted with kinship and honor. Picture terraces stitched with olives and figs, small stone houses with packed earth floors, a one-room home where sleeping mats are stacked away at dawn, a courtyard oven blackened by years of bread. Add to the scene a stream of taxes and rents flowing up and away toward distant elites. Add a purity code that orders meals and bodies and boundaries. Then add Rome, whose soldiers make sure the whole arrangement keeps humming. That is the world where seed is not a metaphor first, but a family's next harvest, where a day's wage buys a day's bread, where a lost coin is not careless budgeting, but a genuine crisis. It also matters who is listening. Jesus speaks to crowds of laborers and debtors, to apprentices who have left their nets and are still blinking in the new light, and to religious gatekeepers who worry that his freedom will corrode the fences that keep the village safe. The same story lands differently in each group. A debtor hears "forgive" and breathes for the first time all day. A landowner hears the same word and wonders how a household can survive without consequences. A tax collector feels exposed and invited in the same heartbeat. The parable draws all of them into the same space and refuses to let them leave with the same face they wore on the way in. Here is another key. Parables are not illustrations for doctrines that live somewhere above the ground. They are announcements of regime change. Jesus' refrain, "The kingdom of God has drawn near," does not describe a private mood. It announces that God's future is stepping into the present to reorder loyalties, possessions, and relationships. The brilliance of the parables is that they smuggle this revolution into stories about flour and fishing. The smallness is not a trick. It is part of the message. Sovereignty arrives looking like yeast in dough or seed in dirt. It looks ignorable until you look again and realize your assumptions are the things that became small. And that is why the parables confuse. We import expectations the first hearers did not share. We prize interior authenticity, personal choice, and individual fairness. First-century villagers lived inside dense webs of obligation. Honor mattered publicly. Shame was a social fact more than a private feeling. Debt was not an annoyance. It was the difference between keeping your plot and losing your name. When a story plays with work, wages, and status, it is not to deliver a management lesson. It is to expose a community's nervous system and then to retrain it. So how do we listen in a way that allows the parable to do its work? Think of what follows as a field kit for hearing disruptive news. First, refuse boredom. The moment you are sure you have got a parable, you have probably shrunk it. Second, let the story breathe before you import theology to tidy it up. Early readers sometimes allegorized every detail, and the Gospels occasionally model this. But the stories themselves often resist being turned into treasure maps with secret keys. Third, look for the hinge, the sentence where expectation flips. That hinge is almost always where the kingdom breaks in. Fourth, feel the social stakes. Who gains and who loses status if this story is true? Fifth, ask not only what does this mean, but what does this do? The parable is trying to produce habits, not only opinions. Test the kit on a tiny image. A lamp goes on a stand, not under a basket. That is not a slogan about being yourself. In a one-room house, a lamp is infrastructure. It extends the day. It makes work possible. Hiding it wastes oil and burdens the whole household. The kingdom, then, is not a private glow. It is public utility. It changes what your home can do. The story presses a decision on a community. Will you let this new light rearrange how people work, gather, and rest? Or will you put it under a basket and pretend it was never lit? Why did Jesus prefer story to straight talk? He could lecture, and sometimes did, but when he wanted to get past defenses and reach desire, he told stories. Narrative is hospitality for the imagination. It opens a side door when the front door is locked. A story lets you try on an identity without swearing an oath, inhabit a stranger's view for a minute, and then come back to your life with altered instincts. In a culture where religious boundaries were carefully policed, story let Jesus invite people to taste the future without first passing an exam about it. Parables are also acts of resistance, not the cinematic kind with banners and swords, but the patient, subversive kind that reshapes moral imagination. Under empire, the available options often look like compromise or despair. Parables refuse that false choice. They announce that another economy is already operating in the cracks. Generosity that disregards the ledger, hospitality that ignores the seating chart, forgiveness that resets impossible accounts, joy that refuses scarcity's math. When that alternative sounds naive, the parable brings it down to ground level. A wage handed to the last in line, a party thrown for a son who should have been shunned, a weed that grows into a bird-haunted tree. Suddenly, the naive thing is the only thing that looks like life. If this still sounds impractical, remember that Jesus was not building a think tank. He was forming a community. Stories do community work. A village that hears about a father humiliating himself to run toward a returning son will argue at dinner about whether that man is a fool or a saint. A crew of day laborers who learn that latecomers were paid the same will grumble or grin, depending on whether they were hired at dawn or nearly missed the day. In that argument, the parable stays alive. It is not a rule pinned to a wall. It is a conversation that keeps shaping a people. Because we live on the far side of these stories, we face a disadvantage. We know the endings. We know the shepherd finds the sheep, the Samaritan stops to help. The seed grows in soil we would have called a lost cause. Familiarity dulls the blade. How do we get the edge back? Re-enter the risk. Before the Samaritan becomes a saint in stained glass, put him back into the story as a member of a despised group whose touch you have been warned about. Before you praise the Father's embrace, remember the shame he takes onto himself to welcome the Son. Try hearing the farmer's losses as real losses, the baker's work as sweaty labor, the fisherman's sorting as back-breaking tedium. Put cost back into the picture, and the grace inside the picture will recover its weight. Another way to keep the edge is to attend to scale and agency. Parables often shrink the kingdom to something disarmingly small, a seed, a pinch of leaven, and then let the small thing do disproportionate work. The inversion is not a flourish. It reveals the way God's action enters the world. The kingdom does not arrive by collecting enough human strength to make a splash. It enters like something slipped into the dough that refuses to stay small. The point is not a romance with smallness. The point is that God's life has its own agency. Your job is not to enlarge the yeast, but to refuse to keep it out of the dough. To keep ourselves honest, we must learn the difference between a parable as provocateur and religious stories used as sedatives. Sedatives have their place when panic needs to be calmed, but if you take them hourly, you stop noticing the smoke. When we deploy a parable to avoid conflict, to justify fear, to bless less an unjust arrangement. To paint our hoarding with piety, we have reversed the current. The parables are alarms inside buildings we have learned to call safe. They ring until we either change what the building is for, or we remove the batteries and call it peace. Parables also comfort, absolutely. Comfort in Kingdom Key, however, is not comfort at someone else's expense. It expands the table and restores the shamed to communal life. When a shepherd slings a sheep over his shoulders and calls for neighbors to celebrate, the comfort is real and public. Joy is not a private mood, but an event that spills into the street. That kind of comfort will feel like a critique to people who preferred the flock smaller, the table cleaner, and the party quieter. One more confusing feature deserves attention. Parables begin in the register of advice and end in the register of announcement. They start with "here is how to live" and end with "here is what God is doing, ready or not." That slide is intentional. It prevents us from treating kingdom life as a self-improvement project, and it prevents us from using God's action as a reason to be passive. God moves, therefore we can move. God forgives, therefore we can forgive. God throws open a banquet, therefore we can throw open our doors. Advice without announcement becomes moralism. Announcement without invitation becomes fatalism. The parables refuse both. Let's get concrete about reading. When you approach a parable, begin with the literal scene. Who is in the frame? What is happening in public view? What are the economic relationships? Do not resolve the tension early. Let it ring. Next, identify the hinge, the line where expectation flips. Then pay attention to your sympathy. Which character feels like us and why? Step into another character's skin until your sympathy shifts and you feel the story pinch. Finally, ask what the story does to your habits if it is true. Name one budget line, one calendar slot, one relationship boundary that would change if the story had its way with you. We also need humility, the courage to let the story challenge our favorite religious reflexes. Many of us read scripture in a way that keeps us on the right side of every conflict. In a parable with an obvious villain, we cast ourselves as the hero without an audition. That instinct protects the ego and starves the soul. Try on the villain. Let the older brother's resentment make sense. Count the calluses on the early worker's hands and hear the homeowner's worries. Then ask what the kingdom does to those sympathies. In almost every parable, someone you were trained to admire loses face, and someone you learned to ignore becomes the teacher. Beneath all this sits a deeper conviction. Parables are not artifacts under glass. They are instruments the Spirit can still play. A living God uses old stories to make new people. Your life, with budgets, deadlines, family schedules, and phones that buzz all day, is a place where these stories can perform their mischief. A single sentence can interrupt a career path bent by fear. A tiny image of yeast can reframe how a small community treats its block. A story about a father can unteach a lifetime of suspicion about whether love must always be earned. Because we will spend time inside the stories in the episodes ahead, name a few pitfalls to avoid. Beware one-to-one mapping everywhere. not every element stands for something else. Sometimes a wage is just a wage until the twist turns it into a protest against our understanding of fairness. Resist the courtroom impulse that uses a parable to settle every doctrine. These are not treatises. Notice hyperbole, planks in eyes, camels and needles, absurd debt amounts as intentional volume knobs. Be cautious with allegory that erases the scandal by assigning each character to a safe abstraction. Most of all, beware domestication by admiration. To admire a parable without obeying it is like applauding a fire alarm. If this sounds like work, it is, but it returns more than it takes, like weeding a garden in cool morning light. Do the work, and you will notice your reflexes shifting. You will be less eager to clutch what you think you deserve, and more curious about where generosity might land if it is not aimed by merit. You will see how often you have allowed respectability to set the boundaries of faithfulness, as if God's kingdom were a dinner party whose main job is to avoid offense. You will also find yourself laughing more easily, because joy is threaded through these stories like sunlight across a table. And once you start seeing it, you realize how much of your life has been lived in shadow. Before we step into seeds and yeast and vineyards and brothers, before we enter stories in which last becomes first, and first must learn to enjoy being last, try reading your own place into the furniture. What is your equivalent of a vineyard contract? A project timeline, quarterly metrics, a fixed pay schedule that promises to reward early starters. What is your version of a banquet? A conference, a wedding seating chart, a fundraising dinner where you place people for maximum effect? Who are the groups you have learned to avoid touching? And what does neighbor love cost you if the road runs through their part of town? Translate the furniture, and the pressure returns. We will keep this field kit close as we move forward. Whenever a story tempts us to flatten it into a proverb, we will pause and listen for the hinge. Whenever we want to moralize it into a self-help plan, we will ask what it says about God's action first. Whenever our sympathy lines up neatly with the people in power, we will step into the shoes of those living with the fallout. And whenever we feel the sting, because some of these stories are barbed, we will trust the barb is a physician's needle meant to let healing in. There's also the question of secrecy. The Gospels say that parables both reveal and conceal. That sounds perverse until you remember how truth functions when the stakes are high. Put a hard word into a parable, and you give people time to decide whether they really want it. You also make the dangerous word portable among the poor and uncredentialed. You make it hard to prosecute. A regime that fears the word kingdom can arrest a prophet who shouts it in the street. It is harder to arrest a farmer talking about seed or a woman talking about dough. The story keeps moving from mouth to mouth, doing its work where sermons could not survive. So listen for mercy in the disruption. If you were trained to think God only speaks in scolding tones, the parables will surprise you with play. A father who throws a party, a woman laughing as dough swells, a shepherd so delighted he drags his neighbors into his joy. And if you were trained to think God is tame, the parables will unsettle you with judgment. A door finally shut after long patience. A tree that does not get infinite seasons. A banquet where seats are taken away from people who used them to keep others out. Mercy and judgment meet here not as opposites, but as two notes of one melody that turns a village into a different kind of people. We are ready then to walk into the stories that are not what they seem, to let small things reveal vast realities, to watch fairness invert under the weight of generosity, to see celebration expose resentment, and to learn that shrewdness and persistence can become virtues in a world where goodness has to navigate crooked systems. Those are ahead. For now, hold the field kit. Do not be bored. Find the hinge. Feel the stakes. Resist easy allegory. And look for the collision of God's action and our response. If you carry that into the next tale, you will find yourself surprised again. And that surprise, far from confusion for its own sake, is the first sign that the kingdom has drawn near. Take the field kit you packed at the end of part 1, refuse boredom, find the hinge, feel the stakes, and carry it into 2 of Jesus's shortest, strangest stories. They look harmless on the surface, a seed smaller than a pinhead, a pinch of leaven tucked into flour. But if you listen with village ears, they come alive with mischief. They are about tiny, suspect things that do something outsized and irreversible. They are about a regime that does not wait for permission, a life that sneaks under fences we built to keep our lives tidy and predictable. They are pictures of God's future, insinuating itself into the present, until everyone has to deal with it. Start with the mustard seed. Picture the hillside where Jesus gestures with 2 fingers as if he is pinching something you can barely see. The kingdom of God, he says, is like a mustard seed that a man took and sowed in his field, though it is the smallest of the seeds you plant. When it grows, it becomes greater than the garden plants and puts out large branches, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its shade. The crowd knows mustard. It is not romantic. It is practical and unruly, sharp on the tongue, quick to spread, hard to fence in, and usually kept to the margins, because once it takes, it keeps on taking. Why choose mustard to describe God's reign instead of a cedar like the prophets? Because the choice itself is the message. We prize what is tall, straight, durable, and centrally planted. Mustard is none of those things. It starts small, multiplies from the edges, disrupts the geometry of your beds, and refuses to respect property lines. Jesus refuses the seduction of grandeur. He names a kingdom that does not impress so much as infiltrate. He wants hearers to feel the difference between spectacle and life. Spectacle is loud and brief. Life is quiet and relentless. Mustard is life. Listen to the social insult buried in the image. A field in a village was both survival and status. You kept your rows clean to show that your household was strong and attentive. Planting mustard inside a field risked chaos. Yet the parable blesses that risk because of the outcome. shade. The shrub grows big enough for creatures that do not pay rent to find rest. If your measure of a good field is neatness, you will rip out the plant that makes shade. If your measure is whether anyone besides you flourishes there, you will let the unruly thing stay, and you will defend it when others complain. Then the punchline, birds. For a farmer, birds are mixed company, beautiful and hungry. They can feel like freeloaders, but Jesus leans into the discomfort. He is drawing from the old picture language where a great tree shelters the nations, and he is daring to say the shelter will come not from imperial timber, but from a scrubby, invasive shrub. The kingdom's hospitality arrives through what you were trained to despise. Birds of the air includes all the creatures you have not planned for and cannot invoice. The question becomes brutally simple. Do you want a field that looks flawless, or a field that hosts life? Now cross the lane to a courtyard where a woman kneads dough. Jesus points and says the kingdom is like leaven that a woman hid in 3 measures of flour until it was all leavened. The picture is household ordinary, but the details explode. 3 measures is an extravagant amount of flour. This is feast bread, not a private snack. And the verb hid hints at secrecy and patience. Leaven is alive. It is a colony you feed so that it will feed you. You tuck it in and wait for what you cannot see to do what you could never do with force. Leaven is morally ambiguous in the village imagination. During the festival that commemorated deliverance, households purged it from their homes to retell a night when you leave in a hurry with bread flat as urgency. In other seasons, leaven was what made daily bread a joy. Jesus chooses the ambiguous thing deliberately. He refuses our habit of nomming some materials permanently sacred and others permanently suspect. He shows that God's life can use what we call suspect to do what we call holy. Feed a crowd with bread that rises. Notice where the action happens and whose hands do it. Not a priest in the temple, but a woman at home. Not the public honor stage, but the place where bodies are fed. The parable doesn't make a speech about gender. It does something subtler and more powerful. It turns a courtyard into a sanctuary and baking into priestly work. The kingdom is not waiting for official platforms. It is multiplying where people fold dough and remember who is hungry. If you have been trained to look for God only in public victories, you will miss the quiet revolutions that begin in kitchens. Here, too, the hinge is clear. Invisibility becomes transformation. What looks like contamination becomes nourishment. The leaven disappears into the mass, and by disappearing it, changes everything. That is a scandal to people who believe goodness must remain separate to remain pure. Jesus proposes a goodness robust enough to make contact without losing itself. He offers an account of holiness that is not a glass bell over a candle, but a starter mixed through a whole lump until the inside begins to breathe. Put mustard and leaven together, and the portrait sharpens. The kingdom is not a rule book you tape to a wall. It is a living agency you host. It does not wait for your budget line to free up. It does not request your permission to break symmetry. It starts small and does not stay small. It moves from edges to center and from from hidden to obvious. It produces shelter and food. It insists that success be measured in shade and bread, not aesthetics and applause. And it knows how to wait, which is not the same as stalling. Waiting here is an active trust that the life you welcomed will keep working when you sleep. Do not blunt these stories into motivational posters about humble beginnings. Jesus is not romanticizing smallness. He is teaching agency. Smallness by itself is no virtue. A tiny dead seed is still dead. A tiny neglected starter is a science project gone wrong. The virtue is aliveness disproportionate to size. Mustard takes a patch you thought was nothing and turns it into habitat. Leaven takes a bowl you thought was static and turns it into a breathing thing. The parables drag you away from control and toward stewardship. Make room for the alive, feed it, and resist the urge to overmanage. That is why these stories antagonize respectability. Respectability prefers boundaries that prevent unpleasant surprises. It prefers predictability over hospitality. It wants a table where no crumbs fall and a yard where no creatures perch. By contrast, kingdom life invites surprise. Birds leave droppings. Bread makes a mess of flour on your sleeves. People arrive you did not account for. Schedules flex because relationships are not widgets. If you find yourself angry at this, the parables want you to feel that anger, and then to ask what exactly you are protecting. Your plan or your neighbors. The images also revise our assumptions about how influence works. We fear that if goodness touches what is unclean, goodness will evaporate. Jesus depicts the opposite. The seed changes the field more than the soil swallows the seed. The leaven transforms the flour more than the flour smothers the leaven. Goodness that is truly alive is contagious. It can carry itself into places that have learned to breathe scarcity and teach them to breathe generosity. The stories do not deny danger. They do deny that withdrawal is the only faithful response to danger. Now bring the parables into your calendar. Where is mustard already sprouting at the edge of your week? Maybe it is a 5-minute check-in with a coworker that refuses to stay incidental and has become shade for more than one person. Maybe it is a standing invitation to a simple meal that never looks impressive but keeps absorbing new people. Maybe it is a neighborhood habit tools left in a common shed, a shared group chat for rides that began as a weed in the plan and has become habitat. Before you tidy these out of existence, measure how much shade they make. Do the same with leaven. Where are your starters, the small, regular practices that multiply beyond their size? Setting an extra place by default, carrying grocery cash so that someone else's humiliation turns into a quiet rescue, blocking an hour on the calendar for walks with whoever needs to talk, budgeting for hospitality before you budget for upgrades, teaching a recipe rather than delivering a casserole so that your gift spreads. These are not glamorous. That is the point. They are leaven. They hide, they work. If you worry that this leans soft, look more closely at the courage required. Mustard invites birds and criticism. Leaven invites waiting and the real possibility of failure. Sometimes dough does not rise. The courage the kingdom requires is not bluster. It is stubborn hospitality in the face of delay and scorn. It is the decision to keep hosting life even when it costs you neatness, speed, or a little reputation. You do not control outcomes. You do control what you plant and what you mix, and whether you keep a door on its latch. There's also a justice sting in these parables. They relocate divine action to places that have been undervalued. A field edge becomes more important than a manicured center. A kitchen becomes more consequential than a platform. A woman's hands are named as the place where the future takes shape. If your community blesses only public, microphone work and ignores domestic, economic, and neighborhood labor, you are preaching a kingdom the parables do not recognize. The shade and the bread that matter most often begin where nobody is filming. Inclusion here is not a sentiment, it is architecture and chemistry. Mustard grows branches. Branches are literal places to land. Hospitality is not an announcement, it is a structure. Leaven expands the inside of bread. Expansion is literal space where more mouths can fit. Inclusion without structure exhausts people. Structure without inclusion starves them. The parables insist that the kingdom builds the kind of spaces and rhythms where strangers can become neighbors, not just for an evening, but as a habit. Listen for older echoes humming under these images. Birds nesting in branches recall the prophet's dreams of a tree raised by God where nations rest. A woman kneading an immense batch to feed a crowd recalls the old stories where households welcomed strangers who turned out to be messengers. Jesus pulls these high hopes down into hedges and kitchens. He is not lowering the bar, he is locating glory where people actually live. Majesty without proximity is a counterfeit. The kingdom is majesty that smells like bread. The parables also force a choice of anxieties. Some anxieties keep communities alive, some strangle them. If you are anxious about losing control, these stories will vex you. If you are anxious that people go unfed and unsheltered, these stories will feel like relief. A farmer who loves symmetry more than shade will hate mustard. A host who loves a spotless counter more than a crowded table will hate leaven. The kingdom asks you which anxiety you will privilege when they come into conflict. Because they are about life, the parables also teach ecological common sense. Healthy systems have messy edges where surprising species thrive. They have microbiomes that turn raw ingredients into nourishment. Translate that into church or team or neighborhood, and you get this. Health looks like margin where new relationships can root, and it looks like slow processes that change texture from the inside. If everything is optimized, nothing can nest. If everything is rushed, nothing can rise. Keep yourself from romanticizing small by remembering that Jesus blesses agency, not tininess. A small group that never risks contact is not faithful because it is small. A tiny ritual kept secret and sterile is not holy because it is hidden. The sign that mustard is doing kingdom work is that birds are finding branches. The sign that leaven is doing kingdom work is that the table keeps stretching because the bread keeps expanding. If if your small things are not making room, they are not the kind of small things Jesus had in mind. Practice sympathy shifts. Stand with the farmer who wanted rows he could admire, and tell the truth about the cost of untidy edges. He is not a villain. He is a person choosing between control and shelter. Sit with the woman who keeps a jar alive, who times her day by the rise, who feeds a colony so that a crowd can eat. She does not get a speech at the feast. She gets flour on her sleeves and aching forearms. Call her work holy. Perch with the birds and feel the shock of safety. They are not freeloaders. They are creatures who finally have a place to rest. Let a thought experiment test the parable's demands. Suppose a community reorganizes by mustard and leaven. Metrics change. Shade created and bread shared, not just events hosted. Budgets change. Money moves to margins and kitchens, places where life multiplies. Calendars change. Leaders block slow hours for relationships because leaven needs time. Architecture changes. Rooms grow flexible, tables expandable, boundaries permeable. Public stories change. Instead of boasting about grandeur, people tell how a tiny practice became a feast. Now imagine the opposite. A community suspicious of uncontrolled life keeps mustard at the fence line and uproots it the moment it wanders. It decides that bread should be flat all year because leaven is messy. Birds leave. People who need shade go elsewhere. The table looks elegant, but seats fewer each season because the bread is thin and the host is anxious. That community will congratulate itself on purity while hunger grows at its edges. The parables do not flatter such success. They warn it. Take the stories personally without privatizing them. Personally, because the decisions live in your fence and your bowl. You can plant or not. You can knead or not. Privatizing, no, because shade and bread are for others. You cannot nest in your own branches. You cannot eat all the loaves your hands make. The goal is communal joy. Birdsong in a tangled hedge, laughter around a table, neighbors who show up for bread and stay to wash dishes. The ordinary miracle of enough. Jesus finishes with seed and starter. He does not hand out worksheets. He lets the pictures sit until they either offend you into inaction or entice you into hospitality. Some listeners walk home defending their fields and their counters. Others feel their fingers itch to plant and to knead. They notice edges where shrubs might belong. They check the jar in the corner for life. They make a first loaf. They tell a first friend. And very soon their yard is loud with wings, and their street smells like bread. If you can hear that, you are ready for the next scandal the parable stage. Not only that small things become vast, but that our yardstick for fairness buckles under the weight of divine generosity. If seed and starter have adjusted your instincts about agency and scale, you will be better able to endure what happens in a vineyard where day laborers line up for wages that refuse to obey the clock. But before we step into that line, let your hands smell like mustard and your sleeves carry flour, because the feeling of life multiplying is exactly what you will need when the math stops working. Walk back to the roadside and listen again for the hinge, because the next two stories slip a crowbar under our most defended furniture, fairness and safety. We like to believe we are fair-minded and prudent. We sort our lives by earned rewards and sensible caution. Jesus walks into those rooms, turns off the fluorescent lights, opens a window, and says, "Watch what happens when the kingdom crosses your math." The room fills with fresh air and arguments. Picture a harvest season morning in a Galilean village. The sun is only a rumor on the ridge, and the marketplace has already gathered a loose ring of men, bodies that no day work by the feel of dust and thirst. Harvest is brief and urgent. Grapes do not wait, and a vineyard that misses its window loses a year's hope. A landowner comes early to the square. He bargains with the first group for the normal day's wage, a denarius, and sends them to his vines. He goes again at the 3rd, 6th, and 9th hours, because the heat has not relented, and the grapes are ripening faster than hands can pick. He goes again near sunset, the 11th hour, and still finds men idle. "Why are you standing here all day?" he asks. "Because no one has hired us," they answer. "You go too," he says, "into the vineyard." The story could end with efficiency and a shrug. A harvest is saved, men carry baskets, wages are tallied. But Jesus sets the hinge at sunset with a choice that feels like a dare. The owner tells his foreman to pay the laborers, beginning with the last and moving to the first. If you are in line near the front, your back still aching, your body already imagining bread for your family, you lean forward to watch what the late group gets. They hold out their hands. The foreman drops a denarius. A denarius, a full day's pay for an hour or two of work. The line becomes an electricity of mental math. If an hour is worth a denarius, what is 12 hours worth? When your turn comes, your palm expects a small stack. But the coin you feel is the same weight the last group received. Heat rises back into your face. You have a speech ready before you climb the step to the owner. These last worked 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat. What you say is the word that drives the whole complaint: equal. You are not wrong about arithmetic. You are nomming a rupture in the social fabric. You have made them equal to us. The scandal is not only the money, it is the dignity that comes with the coin. In a village economy where honor is counted out loud, wages are more than calories. They are a public story about worth. The owner's reply, calm and pointed, answers with a different fabric. "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or is your eye evil because I am good?" Freeze the frame. What just happened? The owner paid the first group exactly what they bargained for. He wronged no one. He also used his freedom to do more than fairness for the last. If you read the parable like a manager, you feel the tremor that runs through your HR instincts. Expectations are volatile now. Precedent has been set. Tomorrow's line will be longer at 5 o'clock. If you read it like a worker who almost didn't get hired, your knees go weak from relief. Jesus does not pick a side, he picks a kingdom. And the kingdom does not give up on people who missed the early hearing rounds. It refuses to allow lateness, whether chosen or imposed, to become fate. That is where many of us flinch. We have been trained to hear justice as equal treatment, and to treat any additional mercy as a theft from those who spent more hours in the field. The parable insists on a different accounting. It keeps contract and adds generosity. It privileges sufficiency over symmetry. Every household goes home with bread. That line, sufficiency over symmetry, deserves to be painted on a wall in any community trying to live this story. Equality is a noble goal when systems are clean. Under conditions of scarcity and exclusion, a rigid symmetry can quietly preserve the advantage of those who were first in line by accident of network, timing, or strength. But won't that encourage laziness? Asks the voice in the manager's head. Not if you read the story closely. The last men are standing in the marketplace at the 11th hour because no one had hired them. In a first-century village, work came through networks and reputation. If you lacked both, if you were a stranger, a newcomer, a man with an injury, a person others distrusted, you waited while numbers were called. The landowner asks why they stand there, and their answer is simple. Because no one has hired us. The parable does not bless freeloading. It exposes gatekeeping. Hear the union conversation forming in the background. Early workers mutter about solidarity. If the boss can pay latecomers the same and we accept it, he can play us against each other forever. But the owner's move, in Jesus' telling, is not a strategy to suppress wages. It is a deliberate inversion to make the last visible and to declare that a whole household's survival matters more than quiet symmetry. He also pays the first group first in dignity. He keeps his word without delay. He addresses them as friend, not as fools. He separates their good wage kept, contract honored from the poison of comparison. He invites them to enlarge their joy. We all get to eat tonight. The line about the evil eye deserves its own moment. In the idiom of the time, an evil eye is stinginess, jealousy, a glare that cannot bear someone else's good. The owner diagnoses the complaint not as an error in math, but as a sickness of sight. Your eye, calcified by comparison, cannot see the good of another without feeling robbed. The kingdom's medicine is to cleanse the eye so that another's sufficiency reads as a gain for the village, not a threat to your merit. The cure is not guilt. It is gratitude widened enough to notice community. Turn the parable toward your life. Where do you insist on symmetry when sufficiency is the more faithful measure? A team distributes training budgets, and you argue for equal slices, even when one colleague needs certification to keep her role, and another is already overcredentialed. A school district considers weighted funding because some neighborhoods have higher needs, and you call it unfair because your child's campus will lose a sliver of extras. A hospital triages care in a crisis, and you rage that your timeline has been altered. In each case, the question is not, is equality nice? It is, what measure produces life for the whole? The parable also offers a rule for leadership. If you have discretion over resources, use it to push sufficiency toward the last in line, even if it means you will have to explain yourself to the first. That explanation may be the most pastoral work you do. The owner does not shame the early workers. He narrates. He names what is true, that he kept his promise. He names what is generous, that he chose to make the last equal in dignity. And he names what is sick, the evil eye that resents mercy. Leaders who cannot or will not narrate their choices tutor their communities in suspicion. Leaders who narrate with clarity and compassion tutor their communities in joy. If you find yourself bristling still, it may be because you hear the owner as a metaphor for God. And then think of the ways you have felt overlooked. First will be last and last first sounds like a threat when you have spent years climbing the line. But Jesus is not promising humiliation to people who arrived early. He is guaranteeing dignity to people who showed up late. The inversion is not petty revenge. It is a refusal to let arrival time be destiny. If that promise stings, the sting may be a sign that comparison has become a habit you confuse with justice. A final observation before we cross to the talents. The owner chooses to pay last first. He could have paid the early workers and sent them away before the surprise. But he wanted the first to see the last receive a full wage. Why? Because hidden generosity does not heal envy. Only visible mercy can retrain a community's instincts. If the first had left with their coin and a private bonus later appeared in other hands, the village would have fractured into rumor. By paying in public, the owner invites the first to learn the village's joy. Whether they accept the lesson is the open question the story leaves ringing. Now for the talents. This story walks into a different room with related air. The scene is not a marketplace, but a household in transition. A master prepares for a journey and summons 3 servants. To each he entrusts a staggering sum. To one 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, each according to his ability. A talent is not a coin. It is a weight, roughly 6,000 denarii, something like 20 years of day wages. Multiply that by 5 and you get a fortune. The master disperses these fortunes with no micromanaging instructions and leaves. The first 2 servants move fast and trade with what has been placed in their hands. We are not told whether they invested in land, lent at interest, brokered goods, or bought debt, only that the money doubled. The 3rd servant digs a hole and hides his single talent in the ground. When the master returns and settles accounts, the first 2 present their doubled sums. The master praises them with identical joy. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful over little. I will set you over much. Enter into the joy of your master. The 3rd servant begins with a speech. Master, I knew you to be a hard man, reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed. So I was afraid, and I went and hid your talent in the ground. Here you have what is yours. Freeze the frame again. The speech is a Rorschach test. If you hear the master as a picture of God, the accusation sounds like slander. But the master does not spend time correcting it. He accepts the premise out of your own mouth and judges on its basis. If you knew I reap where I have not sown, Then you should have at least put my money with the bankers, and at my coming I would have received what was my own with interest. He calls the servant wicked and slothful, takes the buried talent, gives it to the one already flush with 10, and sends the fearful man into outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. How can a story that seems to praise capitalism on steroids live under the same roof as a story that paid everyone a living wage regardless of hours? Some readers solve the tension by releasing the talents from any reference to God at all. On this reading, the master is empire. The first two servants are collaborators who profit by exploiting others, and the third servant is a truth-teller who refuses to participate in the violent economy and is punished for his honesty. The outer darkness is what happens to prophets who uncover corrupt systems. They get cast out. This reading catches a real note. The third servant names a master who reaps where he did not sow, a line that sounds like extraction, not justice. In a world where smallholders were devoured by debt, a refusal to participate could be a form of righteousness. Other readers refuse to split the stories. They hear the talents as a parable about trust and courage. The kingdom entrusts huge responsibility to its servants, and the right response is bold action, not fear. The master's harshness is the pressure of accountability in a world with real stakes. Burying what you were given in the name of safety is the one unforgivable posture. On this reading, the story is not about profiting in money, but about participating in God's project instead of freezing it in the ground of caution. Which reading is right? Perhaps both shed light from different angles, and the hinge is the same in each: fear versus faith, withdrawal versus participation. If you hear the master as empire, the warning is to be honest about the systems you serve. Dignity may cost you. If you hear the master as a figure for the kingdom, the warning is to reject paralysis and join the risky generosity of God. Either way, the servant's fear is the villain. Consider the context in Matthew. The talents sit between warnings about staying awake for the master's arrival, and the scene where the Son of Man judges the nations by how they treated the least of these. The energy is about readiness, responsibility, and the test of love in action. The much you are set over does not look like a bigger portfolio. It looks like a bigger table where the hungry get fed, the thirsty drink, the stranger finds welcome. The servants who doubled their trust are the ones whose work aligns with the master's joy. The invitation into the master's joy is not a private promotion. It is a share in feast work. Notice the moral psychology at work. The third servant's speech begins with an image of authority and ends with the admission, "I was afraid." Images of authority do not stay in the attic of your mind. They run your household. If your operative picture of God is harsh and exacting, you will bury your life. You will call your timidity prudence and your passivity wisdom. If your picture of God is generous and risk-taking, you will act with courage that looks irreverent to fearful people. The parable is not interested in whether you have feelings of courage. It is interested in whether you put entrusted goods into play for the sake of the master's joy. The master's response, for all its severity, exposes another truth. Fear makes you unhelpful even on its own terms. If you really believed I was harsh, you could at least have chosen a low-risk return. The servant's fear is not only timid, it is lazy. It becomes an alibi for doing nothing, and in the kingdom doing nothing is not neutral. There are neighbors to feed and doors to open. The ground where the talent sleeps is the ground where a neighbor starves. A word about the line we love to quote: "To everyone who has, more will be given, and he will have an abundance. From the one who has not, even what he has will be taken." Pulled from this story and dropped into a spreadsheet, the sentence justifies cruel policies. Inside the parable, the sentence names what happens when participation meets abundance and when fear meets scarcity. Courage tends to multiply resources because it puts them into circulation where multiplication is possible. Fear tends to shrink resources because it refuses circulation and calls the refusal safety. The sentence is descriptive before it is prescriptive. Streams grow where water flows. Ponds dry where water is hoarded. Put both parables on the table and look for the through line. In the vineyard, abundance arrives as a wage that makes the last equal to the first in dignity. In the talents, abundance arrives as responsibility that invites servants into the master's enterprise. In both, envy and fear are the resistant forces. Envy resents the last receiving enough. Fear refuses to risk what has been entrusted. The kingdom's answer to envy is public generosity. Its answer to fear is praise for faithful courage and judgment on paralysis that disguises itself as prudence. Do not flatten the nuance. Generosity is not naive about costs. In the vineyard, paying last first means listening to grumbling and accepting a hit to your reputation among the early. Courage is not careless with what belongs to others. In the talents, trading is not gambling. It is intentional action aligned with the master's aims. The kingdom produces people who can hold both truths: mercy that disrupts tidy schedules and stewardship that refuses to hide resources in the name of caution. Walk the vineyard into your workplace. Suppose you lead a team with a discretionary bonus pool. The high performers will do fine. Their contracts and standing already protect them. But a few people had a rough year, care burdens, illness, a project implosion, and without a special intervention, they will go home with anxiety that spreads. You choose to allocate the discretion toward sufficiency for them, honoring existing commitments to the rest. You do it publicly, not to humiliate anyone, but to teach the room what kind of community you are. One where late help is still help, and where survival outranks symmetry. Some will grumble. You will narrate the choice and bless their work while refusing to weaponize comparison. Now walk the talents into the same shop. You recognize people who hide their gifts behind perfectionism. They mistake non-participation for safety. You make clear that what has been entrusted to them is for the life of the community, not for immaculate storage. You reward experiments that align with the mission, even when they do not all double on the first try. You refuse to let the phrase, That's not how we do it. Be the shibboleth that sends energy into the ground. You teach that accountability is not a cudgel. It is the way love keeps promises. When the project bears fruit, you invite the team into joy, not merely into metrics. If you do not hold both parables together, you drift into caricatures. A community drunk on vineyard grace, with no talent's gravity, becomes sloppy, generous in theory, allergic to responsibility, easily captivated by sentiment. A community obsessed with talent stewardship, with no vineyard grace, becomes cold, high-performing, and brittle, where fear of failure dresses up as excellence. Together, these stories school our instincts toward mercy that feeds and courage that builds. Return to the evil eye and the fearful heart as diagnostic tools. In meetings, listen for the eye that twitches at someone else's gain. Why do they get that schedule accommodation? Ask whether what you are protecting is fairness or a hidden hierarchy that keeps you comfortable. In planning, listen for the heart that buries. What if this fails? Ask whether the failure that threatens most is the embarrassment of trying or the real-world costs of doing nothing. In prayer, ask for conversion of eye and heart, gratitude that widens, and courage that acts. Consider how these parables rewrite merit. We often treat merit as a pure fact, effort in, reward out. The vineyard reveals that merit is already downstream of access. Who was chosen at dawn, who had networks, who stood on the right corner of the marketplace, who looked strong enough to convince a foreman. When access varies, rigid merit calcifies injustice. Mercy loosens it. Likewise, the talents teach that merit includes moral nerve, the willingness to put what you have into play for the sake of the master's joy. Numbers alone do not tell the truth about faithfulness. Posture does. None of this means the parables abolish accountability. The vineyard owner does not shrug at the early worker's complaint. He engages it. The master of the talents does not excuse paralysis. He names it wicked. Mercy without accountability breeds cynicism. Accountability without mercy breeds despair. Jesus gives us stories that make both feel possible in the same breath. The practice that results looks like this. Tell the truth about power. Put resources to work for the vulnerable. Call fear by its name. And keep the ledger open to surprise. We should say a hard word about how religious communities use these stories to excuse exploitation. If a church invokes the vineyard to underpay staff, we all serve for the joy. It has reversed the parable, using generosity to rationalize scarcity for the people who do the work. If a ministry invokes the talents to demand nonstop productivity, burying your gifts is a sin. While providing no clear mission or support, it has turned courage into cruelty. The antidote is to return to the purpose. Shade and bread in the first story, the master's joy embodied as tangible care in the second. When metrics devour people, the parables stand up and protest. Sit again with the third servant. It is tempting to despise him. Try to understand him first. Perhaps he grew up under a father who loved rules more than life. Perhaps He learned early that punishment arrives faster than praise, that any misstep brings shame. He carries that ghost into the workplace of faith. When entrusted with a treasure, he only feels its danger. He chooses the one path that looks safe. He buries. Many of us learned religion in rooms that produce this kind of servant. We learned to protect God's honor by refusing to act unless we could guarantee success. We learned to bury. Now reimagine him converted. Suppose the first two servants, instead of basking in their master's praise, had gone to find the third months earlier. Suppose they had said, "We're in this together. Trade with us. If we lose together. If we gain together." Fear often needs companionship to turn into courage. We do not know whether the master would have praised that collaboration or scolded the one who started with less for needing help. But we do know what kind of kingdom Jesus announces. One where strong servants use their strength to pull the fearful into participation. We have spoken of leaders with discretion. What about peers? The vineyard is not simply a king to subjects drama. It is a neighbor to neighbor test. Early workers can choose to bless the late pay. They can also choose to take their coin and go, leaving a sour taste in the village. The parable gives them a chance to become the kind of people whose joy increases as strangers eat. That is learned. It is not natural for most of us. It comes by practice, by catching oneself mid-comparison and saying out loud, "Their bread is not my loss." Bring the household scale to personal budgets. One person hears these parables and thinks tithe, another thinks invest. The kingdom answer is both. Tithe by whatever rule or improvisation your community uses, not because God needs your money, but because you need training in sufficiency over symmetry. Invest by whatever wisdom and counsel your work requires, not because God loves doubles more than singles, but because neighbors need what your skill can create. If either practice becomes an idol, the other will expose it. Let's not leave the economics abstract. Day laborers exist in every city. Men at the curb outside a hardware store, women waiting for a cleaning job, drivers refreshing an app. The marketplace never disappears. It moves to screens. The first parable asks whether we can make choices, individually as employers or collectively as voters, that push our economy toward sufficiency for those last in line. That might look like portable benefits for gig workers, wage floors that reflect the real cost of bread, or public hearing practices that privilege those shut out of networks. And the second parable asks whether we will put entrusted resources to work for good rather than bury them in fear. That might look like deploying capital toward housing that average neighbors can actually afford, financing local businesses run by people who have never had a seat at the bank, or committing time and tools to projects that will not make you famous, but will make your block more alive. If the only investments we can imagine are ones that return to us alone, we have learned the Master's severity and missed his joy. Let a liturgy form around these stories to retrain desire. At the end of a workday, hold your coin real or imagined and say, Thank you for enough. Then ask, who is last in line in my view today, and how can my next choice make them equal in dignity? On the first day of a project, look at what you've been given: budget, trust, team, and say, this is not mine to bury. Then ask, who can I invite into this work so that fear does not get the last word? Liturgy is not magic. It is yeast for reflexes. Children can hear these parables too, if we do not poison them with adult defensiveness. Tell a child the vineyard story, and they will usually say, that's not fair, before they smile that the latecomers got to eat. The smile is the kingdom trying to take root before the grievance calcifies. Tell a child the talent story, and they will want to dig the coin back up and try again with a friend. They do not hate risk. They hate shame. If we can build communities where shame is named and banished, talent will not sleep in the ground. A final pastoral note. Some people are the last in line because of choices they regret. Mercy for them is not a loophole. It is the only path back. Others are the one-talent servant because of trauma and depression, not willful laziness. Courage for them will look like very small movement with a crowd cheering for inches. These parables are not clubs to strike the weak. They are invitations to the strong to use strength for bread, and to the fearful to borrow courage. If we read them that way, we will stop confusing cruelty with rigor and leniency with love. We have spent long inside two stories that are not what they seem. One sounded like economic chaos until we noticed bread on every table. The other sounded like ruthless capitalism until we noticed fear exposed and courage invited. Together, they form a school for our imaginations. Sufficiency over symmetry, participation over paralysis, joy that can celebrate a late wage, and joy that can trust a risky obedience. If you take that school seriously, your budgets and calendars will start to look different. So will your prayers. And there is a next step in the curriculum. If you can celebrate grace when it violates your sense of fairness, and if you can act with courage when fear would prefer a hole in the ground, then you are ready to enter a house where something lost is found, and joy exposes resentment in an older brother who stayed home and never left the line. But before we meet him at the door, hold in your palm the weight of a denarius, and in your mind the weight of a talent. Ask what each is for. If the answer is bread and joy, you are hearing the music. We stopped at a door where music leaks into the night, and an older brother stands outside, arms crossed, counting. Walk through that threshold backward for a moment, because the party is the culmination of two shorter scenes that set the rhythm. Lost, found, rejoiced. In Luke's telling, Jesus is surrounded by tax collectors and other people considered bad for a village's moral immune system, and the Pharisees and scribes grumble. This man welcomes sinners and eats with them. He answers not with a seminar, but with 3 stories that escalate like steps, from one lost among 100, to one lost among 10, to one lost among 2. The effect is to draw the grumblers into a narrowing circle until they have to say something about the party at their own door. Start with the sheep. The question is straightforward and a little impudent. Which of you having 100 sheep and losing one, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the lost until he finds it. Anyone who has patched a fence blinks. In real life, you do not simply drop 99 unguarded to chase one wanderer. You count cost, call for help, weigh risks. Jesus knows that. He frames the question to pinch hearers into admitting a truth they already live by at their best. Some losses are worth irrational recovery because the creature matters. If a single sheep or a single child or a single neighbor were yours, you would run. Notice the verbs stacked like a rescue report. He goes after, he finds. He lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. He calls together friends and neighbors. He says, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep that was lost." The shepherd's joy is not a private sigh of relief. It is an invitation that drags the village into celebration. That detail is the refrain we must not mute. The finding is personal. The rejoicing is communal. And Jesus adds his gloss. There will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. If you take the gloss at face value, repentance here is not primarily an interior speech. It is being found. It is consenting to be carried. It is a surrender that ends in the middle of a street with neighbors clapping. Shift to a house lit at night. A woman has 10 silver coins and loses one. If the sheep story made the men nod, this one brings the women to the center, and the economy is smaller and no less urgent. 10 drachmas could be a day's wages 10 times over, or part of a bridal headdress, or savings saved grain by grain. She lights a lamp, sweeps the house, seeks diligently until she finds it. Then the same refrain, friends and neighbors gathered, the same words, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin that I lost." And Jesus's gloss returns. There is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. Again, repentance is not a hero's speech from the coin. Coins are not talkative. Repentance looks like being located and picked up and restored to the economy of use. The story moves the moral weight to the seeker's perseverance and the community's capacity to share joy when restoration happens. These two scenes have already answered the grumble. If heaven throws parties when lost things are found, what kind of community refuses to dance? But Jesus does not stop at poetry about sheep and coins. He moves into the house where honor lives, because the resistance to joy does not only live in the field or the kitchen. It lives in the heart that keeps ledger books on its own goodness. That heart has a son standing outside. A man has 2 sons. The younger has an idea that sounds like freedom, which is often how disaster introduces itself. He asks for his share of the property now. In a patrilineal village, this is a devastating insult, like wishing the father dead and turning family land, the concentrated memory of ancestors, into liquid cash. The father divides the property. The Greek hints at more than money. He divides his bios, his life. The younger son gathers, travels to a far country, and squanders property in what the older brother later labels reckless living, a phrase roomy enough to hold whatever disgust you prefer. A famine comes, as famines do in stories and in life, and the boy hires himself out to feed pigs, unclean animals in a community shaped by purity rules, and he longs to be filled with their pods. The one who wanted to be filled with freedom now wants to be filled with pig food and cannot be. He comes to himself. The line does not name contrition so much as clarity. How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, but I perish here with hunger. He constructs a speech with two parts: confession, I have sinned against heaven and before you, and demotion. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired hands. He sets it like a rehearsal in his mouth and heads home. The father sees him a long way off. People who have lived with grief recognize that posture, scanning the horizon while pretending to sweep the courtyard. He feels compassion, runs, which older men in that culture did not do if they meant to keep their dignity. Embraces, kisses. Scholars love to note that running like this would expose a man's legs and invite ridicule. The father makes himself ridiculous to intercept the shame that is sprinting toward the son in the eyes of neighbors who would happily script a punishment. The son begins the speech. He gets through confession and never gets to the demotion. The father interrupts with orders: the best robe, a ring, sandals, the fattened calf. Let us eat and celebrate, for this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they begin to party. This is where most sermons end, with the rescued embraced. Jesus is not finished. He has been tightening the circle around the grumblers, and the knot closes now. The older son is in the field, the place of duty, admirable and lonely. As he approaches the house, he hears music and dancing. He summons a servant and asks what the noise means. Your brother has come, the servant says, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. He is angry and refuses to go in. The father comes out and pleads. Listen to the older brother's speech, because it reveals a certain kind of soul we have baptized as righteousness. Look, these many years I have served you, and I never disobeyed your command. Yet you never gave me even a young goat that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fattened calf for him. The metrics are perfect. Years of service, a record of obedience, a ledger with no party credit, a precise accusation projected onto the other's sins. Notice the pronouns. This son of yours. He has adjusted the family tree by grammar. The father answers with a double tenderness. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. That sentence alone could heal 1,000 older siblings whose obedience has turned into resentful distance. He then reframes the event. It was necessary to celebrate and be glad, for this brother of yours was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. The father returns the pronoun to its rightful place. This brother of yours. The parable ends with the door open, the music still playing, the older outside reacting, the father pleading. No resolution is offered. Jesus leaves the grumblers to decide whether they will rehearse their resentments or learn heaven's song. With the story fresh in your ears, take the field kit and find the hinges. In all three scenes, the hinge is the move from private loss to public joy. The shepherd could have heaved relief and slept. The woman could have tucked the coin away and forgotten the night's panic. The father could have welcomed the son quietly to avoid a scandal. Instead, each one calls neighbors and throws a party. The parties are not add-ons. They are the sign that the community has been reconfigured by grace. Heaven's joy is not a mood. It is a feast that changes who sits where. Now feel the stakes. In the sheep story, a shepherd risks reputation for one creature, and a village has to decide if that extravagance is worthy. In the coin story, a woman spends oil and elbow grease for a small circle stamped on silver, and then spends more on celebration than the coin was worth, unless the coin's worth is measured in restored confidence, in the joy on friends' faces, in the practice of not letting small losses teach you to accept smaller lives. In the son's story, a father absorbs shame twice, once when he divides his life, and again when he runs into the street. Then he invites a public that expected punishment to chew the meat of mercy with him. The party is not just for the prodigal. It is a test for the whole village. We have to talk about repentance, because the parables redefine it from a speech about the past to a movement into a future community. The sheep's repentance is measured by acceptance of being carried. The coin's repentance is measured by a plink into a hand that refuses to misplace it again. The son's repentance is partly his speech and mostly his presence at a table he did not expect to see again. Repentance here is not self-loathing. It is allowing yourself to be restored to relationship. It is not less than confession, but it is more than words. It is letting the party claim you, which is why the elder brother's refusal to enter is such a crisis. He has not left home geographically, but he has left the family in his heart. He prefers merit to communion, symmetry to sufficiency, grievance to music. He will keep the law outside if keeping it means he never has to watch his father kiss someone he despises. Jesus is not shamming obedience. He is inviting the obedient to be converted from accountants of worth to celebrants of life. The Father's "it was necessary" is the drumbeat. Joy is not a luxury. It is the only true verdict when death reverses. The party has economics. A fattened calf feeds many households, not just a nuclear family. You do not eat it as a snack. You invite the neighborhood. The expense is theatrical. The father makes a public statement at cost. I refuse to let shame script my son's future. He reassigns status with food and music. Communities have always known how to weaponize feasts to exclude. This feast is weaponized to include. The elder brother's refusal is not only a personal sulk, it is a threat to communal unity. He forces the father to choose between public joy and private appeasement. The father chooses joy and pleads for participation. Where are we in the picture? Many of us live in older brother bodies in which our goodness has calcified into comparison. We can smell when someone else got a calf, and we got a goat-shaped memory of nothing. We can list how long we have obeyed. We can name how others sinned. We can rehearse a life of service into an indictment against the joy of people we do not trust. The parable offers a path to conversion. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. The cure for resentment is not scolding, it is intimacy. You come into the party not by dismissing your effort, but by learning that effort was never the price of the Father's love. It was meant to be the expression of it. Bring the trilogy into present tense. Imagine a community where the sentence, "Rejoice with me," is common liturgy whenever someone is restored. A neighbor leaves rehab and stays sober 30 days. Rejoice with me. A foster placement reunifies with a birth parent. Rejoice with me. A debt is forgiven. A job is offered to someone whose record kept closing doors. A refugee receives status, and estranged sibling texts. Can we talk? Rejoice with me. The practice turns news into feast. It teaches the room that goodness is not rationed, and that joy grows by being shared. Now imagine the opposite. Someone confesses. We nod, say that's nice, and go back to our ledgers. We prefer to keep the 99 safe, to avoid dragging the broom out, to keep our meat for a rainier day. Celebrations are risky. They expose us to disappointment if someone stumbles again. They also expose our hearts if we are not yet free from scorekeeping. So we keep our joy small to keep our pain small. Jesus' stories call that a loss disguised as caution. Heaven is not careful with joy. Heaven throws parties and knows some guests will relapse into wandering. The parties are not rewards for perfect repentance. They are scaffolding that helps love stick. Consider the gendered dignity embedded in the coin story. Jesus refuses a male-only economy of salvation. He tells a woman's labor as priestly work. He lets her call neighbors to rejoice, as a priest calls a congregation to lift their voices. If your community preaches a gospel that never puts a woman in the subject position of divine action, you are preaching something smaller than what Jesus preached. The kingdom advances in kitchens, and its liturgy smells like oil and dust and relief. Consider also the animal dignity embedded in the sheep story. A shepherd's joy over a creature most people would have called expendable becomes an image for heaven's own delight. We can smile and say, "Oh, it's just a metaphor," and then go back to treating non-human life as disposable. Or we can allow the image to stretch our sense of what counts. Communities formed by heaven's joy should be communities where creatures, actual creatures, find safety. If that sounds soft, ask yourself how hard your heart had to become to prefer neat pastures over rescued lives. Return to the Father's run. He does not wait on the porch for the boy to perform contrition. He interrupts the speech not to cancel confession, but to refuse restoration by merit. The robe covers shame. The ring restores authority. The shoes mark him as a son, not a barefooted servant. In a village that would have gladly staged a ceremony of exclusion, think of how easily we craft public penances for other people. The Father stages a ceremony of re-inclusion at his own expense. He absorbs the laughter aimed at his sprinting legs. and turns it into music. This is not cheap grace. The cost is visible in calves and in the Father's walk. Grace is cheap only to spectators who do not count what it costs to bear shame for someone else and to keep pleading with the resentful. The Father honors the older son's faithfulness by saying, "All that is mine is yours," and risks his anger by saying, "But we had to celebrate." Grace takes the hit from both directions, from those who think restoration is too fast, and from those who think love should be effortless. Grace keeps throwing parties under fire. Practice sympathy shifts again. Stand with the older brother long enough to feel the ache that makes his anger take root. He has done the right thing for years without a feast. He thinks the Father's love is an actuarial table, and he's not wrong to notice that the numbers don't add up. Then ask what the party is asking of him. To believe that his years with the Father were already a feast, that the absence of barbecue did not mean the absence of love, that the brother's return does not cut his own portion, that the way to become most himself is to greet the one he called your son as my brother. Stand with the younger long enough to feel the humiliation of town, eyes on your back as music swells. Accepting joy is sometimes harder than earning it. Many of us prefer the hired hand plan because it lets us keep a shred of control. We can be useful. We can contribute. We can explain our place at the table. Being kissed before speaking is terrifying. Letting someone else's joy define your status feels dangerous because it means we cannot manage our acceptance. The parable insists, consent to be loved is the work you could never do by labor. Consent is repentance in kingdom key. Stand with the Father and feel the pull in your chest. To love both sons is to be torn. To plead with the elder is to risk sounding like you care less about loyalty than about welcome. To kill the calf is to invite scrutiny of your household's priorities. To run is to be mocked. To divide your life is to be accused of enabling. The Father does all this because he lives by the "it was necessary" of joy when death reverses. If you lead anything, family, team, church, learn this nerve. You will be misunderstood by both children sometimes. If you mute the party to quiet the older, you will wound the younger. If you ignore the older to feed the mood, you will teach your community that faithfulness does not matter. The Father refuses both laziness and cowardice. He throws the party and goes outside to plead. Extend the parables into structural choices. If heaven rejoices when those shut out re-enter, then policies that make re-entry plausible are not charity. They are congruence with God's party. Ban the box moves on job applications that keep people marked for life, housing rules that make reunification possible, court fines restructured so that a poor person can actually finish paying and be restored, school discipline that aims at reintegration rather than permanent removal. These are ways villages choose parties over ledgers. Critics will call it soft. Ask whether heaven's parties ever sounded sensible to accountants of purity. Extend the parables into church architecture and calendars. Do your spaces say, "We are waiting for you to come home," or "We are managing the 99"? Is there room to sweep, to search, to watch a road? Do your schedules include feasts for restoration? Or do you file them under testimonies and keep the cake in the kitchen? The stories press us to ritualize joy so that resentment has fewer places to hide. It is much harder to sulk while holding a plate at a neighbor's table when your friends are dancing. Make sulking hard. Extend the parables into language. Develop a habit of pronoun correction. This brother of yours, this sister of mine. When you hear your son, answer your brother. When someone says those people, answer with names. The Father's grammar is the kingdom's grammar. It repairs family trees. It makes it harder to weaponize category against relationship. Look again at the phrase, needs no repentance. Jesus' line about 99 righteous persons who need no repentance has teeth. Some communities hear it as sincere. There really are people who do not need to turn. Others hear it as irony. Everyone needs to turn. The trick is who knows it. The trilogy supports the irony. The older brother is the lost-at-home character precisely because he is content with distance, baptized as duty. He cannot repent because he cannot imagine he needs to. He calls the condition faithfulness and the symptom righteousness. Jesus calls it outside. If you are weary from communities that celebrate the return of prodigals without guarding against fresh harm, hear this. Parties do not eliminate boundaries. The Father restores the Son to the family. He does not hand him the accounts the next morning. Celebration is not naivete. It is the first step in a restoration process that includes repair, accountability, and new habits. If a community uses this parable to pressure victims into premature reconciliation or to avoid numbing harm, it has betrayed the Father whose house is ordered by joy and truth at once. It was necessary to celebrate. It is also necessary to rebuild trust wisely. Train your eye to recognize the village-wide crisis beneath private returns. In many places, the lost are lost because systems are designed to dislocate. Predatory lending, zoning that bans affordable housing, courts that monetize poverty, schools that track early and lock doors quietly. When one person returns, the party is real. It is also a sign that we must change the architecture that made leaving look like the only option. Shepherds need better fences. Households need lighting and patterns that make coins less likely to slip. Fathers need communities that will not reward exile. Joy and justice share a table. We cannot ignore the way Jesus stages the stories in response to people who grumble about table fellowship. Eating together is not a garnish on the gospel. It is the gospel's chosen theater. If your version of holiness cannot share a table with a person whose story makes you nervous, you have to choose between your version of holiness and Jesus. He will be found in houses where silver is set down among the bread, and where fathers keep a calf fat for unlikely days. He will be found sweeping with women, and walking hills with shepherds, and leaning in doorways, pleading with dutiful sons to let music correct their math. Every community has older brother apprentices who think their vocation is gatekeeping joy. Invite them into a different apprenticeship, party building. Give them tasks that suit their exactness, measuring tables, counting chairs, budgeting, so that their gifts serve joy rather than constrict it. Teach them to narrate celebration in ways that do not collapse into sentimentality. We are not partying because bad choices are fine. We are partying because death gave back a life. Teach them to say the sentence out loud until it becomes instinct. It was necessary to celebrate. Every community also has younger siblings who learned they are only welcome if they are useful. Replace usefulness with belovedness as the price of admission. That will not make a household soft. It will make it durable. People who believe they are loved can learn to work without resentment. People who believe they must work to be loved will work with a desperation that eventually collapses into rage or collapse. The Father's sentence, "You are always with me, and all that is mine is yours," is an oxygen line for both kinds. Practice household liturgies that keep search and celebration alive. Light a lamp when you look for something lost and say, "We do this because heaven lights lamps." Invite neighbors to rejoice when a small restoration happens. Bring cookies across fences for silly victories and serious ones, so that your body learns to move toward others when joy calls. Throw parties you cannot fully afford, not as financial recklessness, but as a habit of generosity that says, "We will not let scarcity tutor our hearts more than heaven does." Return once more to the pleading Father on the porch. The story ends with a question hanging in evening air. Will the older brother go in? Jesus gives the Pharisees the dignity of choosing. He does not drag them. He invites. He refuses to write them as villains without agency. That is mercy too. It is not only the younger who is allowed to change. It is the ones whose only sin, as they name it, is despairing at grace. We are nearly ready to leave the porch. Before we do, tell the truth about yourself. Where are you refusing a party because it includes someone whose history offends you? Where are you longing to be carried and ashamed to say so? Where are you holding a broom at midnight and tempted to quit because nobody sees you sweeping? Where are you a father who will need to sprint at dawn and be laughed at? Name it, and then ask for the conversion these stories aim at. An eye that can rejoice at another's restoration, a heart that can consent to be restored, a body that can throw feasts and sweep floors and plead on porches without fatigue becoming cynicism. From here, the stories will take a turn that tests our comfort with holy mischief even further. If the kingdom throws parties for the found, what does faithfulness look like inside systems that do not care for parties? Systems where managers are shrewd and widows have to bang on doors to get justice. The next episode will ask whether cunning can be a virtue, and whether persistence is the kind of prayer heaven hears. For now, stay at the door until you can walk in. The music is not a metaphor. It is a rehearsal for a world where joy is governance and feast is policy. And nobody counts goats when a brother comes home alive. You are still on the porch with the pleading Father's words lingering. It was necessary to the street wakes you the next morning with other sounds, a landlord and a steward whispering in a doorway, the slap of documents on a table, a widow rapping at a magistrate's gate before sunrise. Joy had its night. Now morning turns to management and courts, and Jesus, as if to make sure nobody leaves his teaching in the realm of sentiment, tells two stories that enter those rooms where money and power pretend to be the only languages people speak. They are not what they seem. One looks like a masterclass in hustle. The other looks like nagging dressed as prayer. Together, they train a community that knows how to throw parties to also survive paperwork and indifference. The first story smells like invoices and panic. A rich man, Jesus says, has a steward and a state manager who is accused of squandering his master's property. The rumor is serious enough that the master summons him. What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you can no longer be manager. The verdict is ahead of the audit. The steward is fired in principle and kept long enough to hand over the books. That delay is his tiny window, and he knows it. He also knows himself. I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. He is too soft for a shovel and too proud for a cup. He needs a third way in the hours before the locks change. He sits with the ledgers and begins to improvise salvation. He calls in his master's debtors one by one. How much do you owe? He asks. 900 gallons of olive oil, says one. Take your bill, sit quickly, and write 450. And you how much? 1,000 measures of wheat. Take your bill and write 800. The adverb quickly carries the scent of collusion and adrenaline. Before the master's servants hear, before the gossip hardens, the steward is writing down obligations and writing himself into a future where people will owe him hospitality. Every hearer's stomach tightens. What is happening? Is he cheating? Is he canceling legitimate debts or shaving off the illegal interest and his own commission? First-century contracts often hid fees in quantities. Lowering the paper balance could, in effect, subtract the steward's cut and perhaps some exploitative margin. The parable does not specify. Jesus refuses to feed either moralists who want him to condemn the trick or cynics who want him to praise theft. He narrates the outcome. The master commended the unjust steward because he had acted shrewdly. The master admires the move even if it cost him. Then Jesus delivers the line that still embarrasses the pious. The children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the children of light. Freeze the scene on the master's face. He has been outmaneuvered and yet cannot help admiring the play. The steward took his last hours of access and converted them into a network of gratitude. He did not build a fortress, he built a welcome. He traded numbers for neighbors. The master calls that shrewd, which in Jesus' mouth is not a dirty word. It is a way of saying, snake-wise, the partner virtue to dove harmless, that Jesus tells his apprentices elsewhere to pursue. Shrewdness is moral intelligence in a crooked world. The capacity to see how systems actually move, to choose an action that bends them toward mercy, and to do it before the window shuts. The point lands with a jolt. Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous mammon, Jesus says, so that when it fails, they may welcome you into eternal dwellings. Money mammon is named unrighteous, not because every coin is cursed, but because the money system by which most people lived was already compromised by favoritism, extraction, and imperial siphoning. In that world, the question is not whether to touch money. It is whether to convert money into relationships that outlast money's reign. If you cannot, money is your master. If you can, money becomes a tool that funds a future you cannot buy. Friendship, welcome, and mysteriously, hospitality that echoes into eternity. Then come the smaller hammers that shape habits. One who is faithful in little is faithful also in much. If you have not been faithful with unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you with true riches? You cannot serve God and mammon. Jesus will not let admiration for cleverness turn into idolatry of technique. Shrewdness is not permission to worship the hustle. It is a summons to demote money to the rank of servant and to judge strategies by whether they end in sheltering life. If using money does not end in friends and welcome, you are still in the old kingdom, even if you attend its services with perfect punctuality. Sit with the steward long enough to learn his craft without catching his disease. His disease is squandering, leaking responsibility into self-protection until the books accuse him. His craft is crisis conversion, turning an impending fall into an occasion for mercy. Many of us were formed either to despise craft, as if saintliness and incompetence were siblings, or to baptize disease, as if any win for our side is gospel. Jesus refuses that split. He wants disciples who can run numbers and run to the poor, who can read contracts and read rooms, who can smell a closing window and still have breath to bless. Enter some examples close to the ground. A community center faces a budget shortfall and an empty wing after a tenant leaves. The shrewd move is not to wait for a perfect paying partner. It is to leverage the vacant space for friends, allow mutual aid groups, recovery circles, and immigrant legal clinics to inhabit it at below market rates now, creating a web of gratitude and use that will outlast the crisis. A church learns that an elder care facility next door will be sold and flipped luxury. Shrewdness moves fast to create a consortium of neighbors and nonprofits to make a bid with mission-driven financing, shaving a developer's margin by adding a city incentive debt reduction in parable key, but with lawyers and spreadsheets. A small shop knows a layoff is looming and chooses, while cash exists, to prepay severance and call partner businesses to line up interviews, so that when mammon fails, people land in homes and jobs, not in holes. But isn't that just savvy philanthropy? Someone asks. Not if it costs you leverage you would otherwise hoard. Not if it bends contracts toward mercy rather than merely garnishing reputation. Not if it pushes power downward. Shrewdness in the parable is not a stunt to collect applause. It is a restructuring of relationships so that when the storm hits, people find doors already open. The steward did not write letters of recommendation for himself. He cut debts. The difference matters. there's also a needed caution. Shrewdness without integrity becomes manipulation. Faithful in little stands there to save us from cleverness that leaves neighbors colder. If your strategy leaves you more insulated and others more exposed, you have not converted mammon. Mammon has converted you. If your shrewdness requires the secrecy of shame rather than the discretion of love, you are building the wrong kind of shelter. The master admired courage under pressure, not corruption dressed as brilliance. Notice how the parable respects time. The steward moves quickly. He recognizes a window and acts before it closes. The children of light often miss moments because we sanctify hesitation. We confuse caution with holiness and call paralysis prudence. Jesus praises haste when love is possible now. He also does not romanticize desperation. The steward is desperate and still thinks clearly. Kingdom people need that skill. The ability to breathe inside a crisis and ask, who can be helped in such a way that our future becomes more communal than it was yesterday? Keep one more element in view. The steward bets on hospitality. His end game is not a new job description. It is a place to sleep. They may welcome me into their homes. His vision of safety is communal. That matters in cultures where security is imagined as personal savings guarded by personal locks. Kingdom safety is a network of doors. Shrewdness is the art of building such a network before the sirens begin. The second story lives in a courthouse where power yawns. Jesus tells of a judge who neither feared God nor respected people. A widow comes again and again. Grant me justice against my adversary. She is exactly the person most likely to be ignored. No husband to defend her. Little money to oil the bureaucracy. No army of cousins to crowd the hallway and lean on the clerk. The judge refuses for a while, but afterward he says to himself, though I do not fear God or respect people, yet, because this widow keeps bothering me, I will grant her justice, so that she will not beat me down by her continual coming. The phrase beat me down is comic and telling. In idiom, it suggests a black eye. The judge is allergic to annoyance. He moves not from conversion, but from exhaustion. We are meant to laugh and then to learn. Jesus draws the lighter to heavier inference. If even a corrupt judge gives in to persistent petition, how much more will God, who cares for widows by definition, bring justice to the ones who cry out day and night? And then the line that sticks like a splinter. When the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? Hear the pairing with the steward. In both, a vulnerable person faces a system stacked against them. In both, someone uses the tools available: debt reduction, repeated petition, to bend the system toward mercy. In both, the outcome is public, written bills altered, a verdict rendered. But the widow's tool is different. She has no ledgers, no access to accounts. She has her voice and her feet. She refuses to disappear. She turns persistence into pressure. Jesus calls that faith. We are tempted to sentimentalize the widow, soften her into a pious emblem of prayer as private glow. The story will not allow it. Her prayer is noisy, embodied, inconvenient, and juridical. It is aimed at a verdict, not a vibe. The judge names it bothering. That is instructive. Some prayer does not so much soothe as it stubborns. It does not anesthetize pain. It directs it toward a door over and over until the door opens. When Jesus asks whether he will find faith, he is not asking whether he will find warm spiritual feelings. He is asking whether he will find people who keep showing up with names, cases, files, and hope that refuses to die, even when the clerk rolls her eyes. If you carry the trilogy of Luke 15 in your bones, lost, found, party, this next pair teaches what it costs to keep parties possible in the world as it is. Sometimes you can improvise mercy from within, like a steward leveraging his last authority to lighten loads. Sometimes you must press from below, like a widow pounding a door, until a bored magistrate gives a just order. The kingdom's people need both muscles. Cunning that finds openings in unjust architectures, and persistence that hammers those architectures until they make room. Translate widow faith into practices that do not require unusual charisma. It looks like bureaucratic tenacity on behalf of neighbors, learning the phone tree at the benefits office, showing up with a friend to every appointment, filing the correct form the day after a rejection with a letter that cites the regulation the clerk skipped. It looks like small claims competence, knowing how to document wage theft and bring a case, not to ruin a business, but to set a norm. It looks like a neighborhood courtroom in miniature, a rotating crew that accompanies tenants to hearings, writes polite but relentless emails to management, and keeps records of every promise until repairs happen. It looks like praying with names and docket numbers, and when the answer lands, throwing a party with cake and copies of the signed order pinned on the wall. Someone will say, "This sounds political." It is civic. The widow is doing civics at a threshold where the civil has gone cold. The alternative to such work is not purity, it is abandonment. If our piety cannot survive fluorescent lights and laminate floors and bored clerks, it is not the widow's kind. And if our prayers stop at the door rather than stepping through when it opens to help reform the room, they have not yet learned the second half of Jesus's "how much more" promise. Now bind the steward and the widow with Jesus's hard sentence. You cannot serve God and mammon. Neither story permits us to stay neutral about money's gravity. Shrewdness uses mammon against itself. Persistence demands that mammon stop ruling courtrooms. Both end in relationships, friends, welcome, restored standing that mammon cannot purchase, but often prevents. The test for our strategies is therefore simple. Are more people able to feast, rest, and pray because of what we are doing? If yes, we are learning the steward's craft and the widow's faith. If not, we may be decorating the machinery that wears people down. We need to rescue prayer from two traps if the widow is to be our teacher. The first trap is magic treating prayer as a lever by which we make God do what we want. Jesus, how much more, is not a formula. It is an assurance that the character of God is not like a bored judge. The second trap is resignation, treating prayer as something we do when we have decided the world will never change. The widow refuses both. She prays because she believes someone with authority can and should act, and she keeps praying because delays do not cancel right. In that sense, her persistence is a protest against despair, and her faith is stubbornly public. There's also a personal edge. Many of us do not pray persistently because we were taught not to be a bother. We learn to be tidy with feelings, contained with needs, efficient with requests. The widow is unruly by those standards. She models a shamelessness that is not self-centered, but justice-centered. She is willing to look like a nuisance to secure a judgment that will restore life. If you have been trained to be quiet in order to be good, the parable invites you to holiness that occasionally knocks louder. How do these stories correct our earlier ones? Mustard and leaven taught us to welcome life at the margins and in kitchens. Vineyard wages and talents schooled us in generosity and courage. Lost and found rehearsed communal joy. The steward and the widow teach us that kindness without cunning and prayer, without persistence, will wilt in a world where paperwork and indifference can starve a household as effectively as a famine. They answer the objection that Jesus' teaching is just nice. There is nothing nice about reworking ledgers at speed for someone else's future, or about wearing out the shoes you need to keep showing up at a door that keeps pretending you do not exist. A few misuses are worth nomming before they do harm. Some read the steward as permission to get results by any means necessary. They baptize bribery, celebrate opacity, and praise charisma that bends rules. Jesus gives them no such license. Shrewdness is constrained by faithfulness in small things and by the end goal of friends and welcome, not self-exaltation. Others read the widow as exaltation of nagging that never accepts no, and they turn prayer into tantrum. Jesus gives no such blessing either. Her persistence aims at justice, and once the verdict comes, her work becomes celebration, and then structure that prevents the need for the same case again. There is a tenderness tucked into these hard rooms. Jesus chooses a steward on the edge of unemployment, and a widow with no leverage as his teachers. He does not send us to a well-positioned philanthropist or a charismatic movement leader. He sends us to people with very little who leverage what they have for others. If the kingdom were a school, the masters of practice would not be the glittering or the credentialed. They would be a bookkeeper who learns to move with speed, and a woman who refuses to let the door forget her knock. What of the line when it fails? Jesus speaks of mammon in the future perfect, not if it fails, when economies wobble, status crumbles, jobs evaporate, screens go dark. Friends made by means of mammon, real relationships fostered by using money to relieve burdens, become not just a safety net, but a foretaste of eternal dwellings. Do not postpone all of that phrase into heaven. The eternal breaks in whenever a household becomes the kind of place where someone set free from a bill eats at your table and sleeps on your couch. That is not afterlife only. It is kingdom life now. You may be thinking, I am not a manager, and I am not a widow. What do I do? You are someone with some access to some lever somewhere. The question is not whether you preside over a ledger or stand at a courtroom. It is whether you can see where mercy requires strategy and where justice requires stamina. Maybe you sit on a hearing committee. Shrewdness rewrites job postings that screen out people without degrees, but full of skill. Maybe you are a teacher. Persistence looks like accompanying a student to the office until the paperwork that unlocks services is actually filed. Maybe you are retired. Shrewdness is turning a spare room into a welcome room for a friend who needs 6 months. Maybe you are young. Persistence is organizing classmates to appeal a petty rule that keeps the poor off the team. These are not add-ons. They are what it looks like to answer Jesus' question about faith with a life. Bring the stories back to prayer as breath. If we pray like the widow, our calendars will show it. Weekly intercession, not only for generic peace, but for specific cases in our neighborhood. Lists that get updated when a decision lands. Fasts that push us into clarity rather than into performance. If we act like the steward, our budgets will show it. Lines that move every quarter toward people, not projects. Margins kept for crisis generosity. Savings that are not only for us later, but for others now in moments when a quick reduction prevents collapse. One more turn of the screw. Jesus ends the widow's story with a question about faith, not about outcomes. That is mercy. Some doors will stay shut longer than a human life. Some systems are so bent that widows die knocking. The parable does not mock them by promising quick fixes. It honors them by calling their persistence faith, even when the gavel is slow. That frees us from measuring prayer solely by victories and binds us to pray and act because of who God is, not because of the speed of the clerk. Let the two stories reteach leadership in the church. Pastors and elders are stewards of households that do not belong to them. Shrewdness might look like canceling debts in practice, abolishing fees that quietly exclude the poor, forgiving old charges for counseling, reshaping membership expectations so that a single parent can belong without drowning. Persistence might look like refusing to stop praying and advocating for change in local housing or policing, even when a few donors prefer a calmer bulletin. In both, faithful in little is the diagnostic. If you cannot use a tiny discretionary fund to make friends for those who need shelter, you will not steward true riches when they arrive. Let the stories mentor businesses. Entrepreneurship in Kingdom Key is not a holiness tax on profit. It is the cultivation of products, services, and workplaces where mammon is a servant that feeds friends. That includes fair wages as a floor, yes, but also creative practices that create on-ramps for those who missed the first rounds of hearing. It includes transparency, where hidden fees prey on the precarious. It includes internal benevolence funds, where a steward's crisis conversion becomes policy, interest forgiven when illness strikes, no questions asked bridge grants when a worker's car dies, vendors paid early when they are small and struggling. Let the stories mentor citizens. Vote not simply for abstractions, but for structures that sound like the steward's reductions and the widow's verdicts. Bankruptcy processes that do not crush the poor forever. Public defenders funded to answer calls. Caps on interest that keep families from bleeding out. Eviction courts with mediators trained to preserve tenancies. Child care policies that let a widow knock without losing her job. Those who fear politics here should ask whether the fear is of contamination or of losing the illusion that the kingdom can be practiced without touching the world's levers. Now zoom down to a single kitchen table, because these stories are not only macro. A family calculates whether to take in a cousin who needs 6 months after a conviction. Shrewdness asks what debts can be reduced so that the household can absorb the person without imploding. Maybe subscriptions get cut. Maybe the nicer car is sold. Maybe the cousin pays rent in chores until work arrives. Persistence shows up as daily check-ins, calendar reminders for probation meetings, and relentless encouragement when a job falls through. Prayer in this house is not a ceremony alone. It is a schedule, a spreadsheet, a stack of stamped envelopes, and a casserole that appears when the cousin has a hard day. A last weaving of threads. Jesus' parables have moved us from seed to salary, to shoes on a porch, to receipts and courtrooms. The direction is deliberate. He has not built a museum of ideas. He has taught a school for desire and practice. The curriculum ends not with a test, but with a question hanging in the air. Will he find faith? In the language of these stories, faith looks like this: hosting life that starts small and refuses to stay small, rejoicing when grace violates symmetry, entering parties you did not schedule for people you do not control, spending the coin of your reputation so a neighbor can stand, and when the door stalls, knocking again tomorrow. Before you leave the porch and the office and the courthouse, write a small rule for your life on the inside of your hand. Let it be simple enough to remember when the alarm rings too early and the inbox is a tangle. Something like, make room, keep knocking. Choose friends over trophies. Keep a party ready. You will not keep it perfectly. Neither did anyone in these stories. But the keeping is not what saves you. The kingdom keeps you. It keeps coming like yeast in a bowl, and like a widow's fist on a door, and like a steward's quick pen that turns numbers into shelter. If you listen closely, you will hear the old refrain surge again under fluorescent lights. Rejoice with me. Someone's debt is lighter. Someone's case was heard. Someone's door opened. Set the table. Call the neighbors. Then ask, before the music starts, who still needs us to be clever and who still needs us to be stubborn. Answer with your calendar and your budget and your knock. And if you ask, how will I know I am not just playing at this? You will not be left without an answer. You will know when your strategies end in neighbors, not applause. You will know when your prayers end in phone calls and meetings and casseroles and rides. You will know when resentment loosens its grip in your chest at someone else's wage, when fear loosens its grip on what you buried, when duty turns into dancing you did not schedule. You will know because joy will stop being a guest and will become the house you live in. This is where the confusing parables bring us, not to tidy morals, but to a way of being that can survive contradiction and hostility without losing its tenderness. If you have carried the field kit through every story, refuse boredom, find the hinge, feel the stakes, resist easy allegory, look for the collision of God's action and our response, you now have more than a kit. You have muscle memory. Use it tomorrow when the phone rings with news you did not want, when a bill arrives that feels like an anvil, when a friend admits a mess that will not be mended by a proverb. In those moments, do what the parables trained you to do. Plant something small, pay sufficiency before symmetry, celebrate any return, get cunning for the sake of mercy, and pray like a widow who believes the judge is not God, and that God is better than